Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Saving the World podcast with Luke Macmichael and Martin Rezny. And today, our very special guest, Alex MacIsaac, the Executive Director of the World Federalist Movement of Canada. And today, we're going to be all talking about World Federalism and the World Federalist Movement. And we're going to hear a lot from Alex about what it's all about and how it ties in with all the work we're doing here in saving the world, and how it can teach us all a little bit how to be a better global citizen and everything that goes along with that. So Alex, do you want to go ahead and start? We'll give you the floor for a little while. You can introduce yourself and tell us all about the World Federalist Movement of Canada.
Absolutely. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. World Federalist Movement Canada, we are a not-for-profit organization. We work to improve global democracy and improve the efficiency as well of any global institution around the world, which includes, but is not limited to, of course, the United Nations. We have various projects in various areas. A lot of them, as you said, overlap with the goals of your podcast. We have 5 rings in our logo, and I feel like that really describes what we're about, where the 5 rings interconnect and they overlap, and that's how we really see the world system. So we have the first ring, of course, which would be the world environmental ring. So world environmental justice, we have a ton of issues in there like climate change, which are, very big problems for humanity and amplify the others. We have the peace and security ring as well, which global security, of course, overlaps into other factors. Not only do environmental disasters perpetuate war, but they are also a cause of it. So um, we would have the global democracy ring, which is the most important and central one in a lot of our memberships view. The ring for global democracy is advocating for more democratic systems to not only the United Nations, but other bodies such as the International Monetary Fund, for example, where the United States holds an effective veto in those proceedings. The big one that comes to all our minds, of course, is the United Nations Security Council, where only 5 members have a permanent seat. It's not representative, and there are 10 rotating seats around that. So not only is it not a representative of the international community or world citizens, as we would say, it's also ineffective because the veto prevents any action from taking place. And so that ties again back to our peace and security ring. Then we would have the world economy. Anything related to the world economy, the 2008 global financial crisis was a big crux for us. We've argued in the past for a financial transactions tax, and we've gotten some ground on that too. And the final ring is human rights and global justice. Human rights around the world strengthen democracy, and they're affected by democracy. They play very clearly into the global economy for standards of living. They play into environmental rights that we all share, so on and so forth.
Excellent.
So those 5 rings really represent World Federalist Movement Canada, their interconnectedness, and how we try to push for different projects in all of these areas. And as I mentioned, of course, you see global democracy there at the top because we believe that the biggest flaw right now in our international system is the very fact that it's an international system and not a world system, where we can't really make rules through the United Nations General Assembly, which are binding on nation states. But the Security Council is the only one that can, and that is dominated by 5 permanent members who also wield nuclear weapons. So in terms of our projects for peace and security, where we're advocating for the abolition of nuclear weapons, so nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, we don't feel like that is possible under the current system, where we need to fix not only the Security Council, but move away from the Security Council or find ways around the Security Council so that we can actually have effective representation at the United Nations.
Just one quick question off the top, but there isn't one secret ring to rule them all, right?
No, there is no one secret rule. So if you just had, say, global democracy, you would not really find peace and security necessarily. You wouldn't find world environmental justice. So we don't really feel like there is one of these rings that would solve them all.
Okay. Just checking. Just
No,
to be
and
clear.
thanks so much for sharing the overview, Alex. It's definitely so much in line with everything we've done. We started with our 4 pillars and moved to 5, and now we're up to 7, and they very much kind of in hand in hand. I won't touch too much on this because we really want to focus on you guys today. But I just really love all the synergies and all the similarities that I'm finding with all these other groups, and I love kind of learning about them all and figuring out ways that we can learn from each other and take it and run and actually implement some of these great ideas that are starting to get more on the internet. They're starting to get a lot more attention, particularly with COVID. I found, like you mentioned, that people are just starting to kind of question the way things are. They're questioning what matters most in society and in the world. And, societies and groups like this that are just giving people some hope and giving some people some ideas on how the world could function better, I think are just wonderful. So yeah, let's dig deep into some of these things, I guess. So Martin, do you have any questions you want to start with, or any of these 5 rings or pillars or whatever we want to call them that we want to dig deeper into first?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about, because my background is I have a major in political science. So I'm always interested in particular things like if somebody says like they're for democracy, or when they're describing some sort of security aspects of what they're trying to do. So what's always interesting to me is to ask about some of the like specific, like, so what do you mean? Because for instance, with democracy, you have like 50 theories or definitions of what democracy is, and it very much depends on if you're saying you're for democracy, what it is that you're trying to implement. So maybe, I guess, the most important question to start with, because democracy seems to be a big part of what you're proposing, if not the main one. So when you're saying democracy, what do you mean by democracy, technically?
Sorry, I'm just getting my lights back on here.
Sure.
Yeah, so for democracy, of course, there are many systems, as you say, and none of them, I would say, is perfect. We haven't perfected democracy as a concept as human beings yet. We throw the term around a lot, of course, as you accurately stated, but we never really get down to what it means and an exact system for it. So for World Federalist Movement Canada, it does come down to trying to improve the representation of nation states, the representation of world citizens on the world stage. The So as I was saying earlier, the current system, even though we see that democracy is not really there with the Security Council, there is at least a voting process, right? And there is a way that people become representatives of nation states, sometimes more democratic than others, and they actually end up making those decisions. So there is a level of democracy, but it's appointed democracy. So in that sense, we would move towards a more democratic system, whatever the reform would be, and we do so in various ways. So our big one right now is in terms of the Security Council. Of course, Joe Biden and other world leaders have made statements that they want to increase the size of the Security Council, but it's very clear that with respect to democracy, it would not be very wise to increase the number of permanent seats, but rather the number of non-permanent seats to kind of tackle that idea of preventing vetoes from happening. Because if a veto happens, then that's not really democratic, because even though there might be a vast majority in favor of something, it would be turned down. So it's this idea that we can identify situations that we don't deem democratic and try to fix them. And it happens very differently at very different levels of government. So in terms of the United Nations General Assembly, it's this problem that I was speaking of, appointed representatives. We want to actually elect members of the General Assembly in what we call a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. That is one of our big projects that we work with Democracy Without Borders with.
So something like a European Parliament, more.
Exactly. Yes. And that is really the concept of world federalism, because world federalism is not really a concept that people grasp immediately. It's not one that people recognize. Even in foreign affairs academics, they might not have heard of world federalism, but if you can imagine a world federation, you'd have nations and a global government as well, just the same way that within nations we have federal systems where we have municipalities, provinces or states, and then we would have the national government.
Quick question on that, Alex. So if you have, say, China or some other communist nation that comes into a world federalist system of some kind, and they basically have never really had a democracy before, like in the same way anyway, would they be able to just appoint people? Or are we saying in order for them to be part of the World Federalist Movement, they would have to adopt democracy as their main kind of standard? Do you talk much about that? And what's the plan there to kind of bring everyone together?
The federal level of government would have very minimally or minimal powers that are constitutionally limited. And in that sense, China would still have its own internal political system. However, in order to be represented at the federal stage, they would have to have something that passes, the basic line where we would have elections. So
Yeah.
the seats would not necessarily be distributed by country is one thing as well. So if China would want to be represented at the world federal stage, they would have to have separate elections where the world citizens that are part of whatever constituency they would form would then vote for these representatives. So China is a more difficult, country to deal with because of its large population as well. And when we're talking about a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, we're not necessarily talking about one country, one vote, because that's not very democratic either. And so for China, they would probably have their own seat and share a second seat or something like that with another territory. So India would probably have its own seat as well, same thing, because of their large population, and they'd probably share a seat with another neighboring region.
So would the long-term goal be with the UN Parliamentary Assembly to have it based on, say, population? So China would eventually have 10 seats to US as one because they have 10 times the population, or something like that eventually? Or is that kind of the long-term goal?
That is one of the considerations is definitely population. Another one is, of course, regional representation. So it wouldn't necessarily be 10 times the seats, but it would definitely have more seats. In terms of Canada and the United States, we would probably have 2 seats each. And then we would kind of split Canada and the US in the middle. And we would have West Canada seat or electoral district, really, and an Eastern Canada US electoral district as well. So New York would be voting with Ottawa, and California with Vancouver and other cities.
So you wouldn't be factoring in other things like, I don't know, military power. So sort of like these sort of hard geopolitical factors that play into security traditionally.
We definitely exclude that in our hypotheses and our theorizing around it. But realistically, if something like this were to happen, as we know, hard power does come in, and military power would probably have an influence on the distribution of seats. But ideally, we're against that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I really like this concept. I'm just trying to figure out a way where you can kind of sell it to everybody on both sides of the aisle, and I feel like there'd be a lot of pushback from, say, the US or other, countries that would be misproportionately represented at first, for example. If they only had one seat, but they have, 90% of the military budget or something. So I think it's going to be very tricky to kind of have a system where multiple sides won't complain so much so that it never happens, right? And how do you find enough of a balance that you can get enough people excited about it from enough different sides of different aisles that you can actually implement it at some point? Have you had much thought there on how to actually bring it together and how to actually take this from today, where we are today, to gradually get it to a point where everyone's happy with it or everyone's willing to accept it?
Yeah, the executive director of Democracy Without Borders, who we work with closely when we reach out to MPs and senators about the idea for their endorsement. He has worked on multiple books actually about the concept, and that's where it gets tricky in terms of your question earlier, Martin, where what is democracy? What is the system that we're proposing? Because the system is almost gradually increasing, and that's how it would have to happen. There's no way that we'll wake up tomorrow and we'll have a world federal government or a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly as we idealize it. It would have to be something gradual, and there's this big concept which is called log rolling in international affairs. And with log rolling,
Could you please repeat that? What did you say?
Log rolling.
Log rolling?
Log rolling. So imagine a rolling log,
right.
and yeah, so the idea is that you have certain states eventually which would want to for or be part of this world federation, and then they would kind of create their own world federal zones. And eventually, if we have more than 50% of the world economy, we start including limits. So if you back out of this and you don't abide by the tax regimes or the economic policies that we propose, or the environmental policies especially would be a big one at the time, then they would be excluded from certain trade regimes. They would be excluded from participating in certain councils at that stage. And the European Union has done that very well to prevent any nation from just backing out of the European Union and kind of having some sort of consequence, so that it's not always sunshine for them.
So in your theory of power, you would be much more for the, let's say, German approach of using economic power or economic pressure, or even incentives. It doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to be the stick. Could be the carrot. But ultimately, you would like to use that kind of power much more so than any kind of military power.
Yes.
Or because I looked at your constitution, and it's sort of right at the beginning says something like it's not really backed by the military, or like that the government is not principally deriving the sort of, it's not, I'm not sure how it's exactly phrased, but it's like basically sort of renouncing the military. It's like one of the things that's very early on in the constitution that I've sort of perused briefly before we had a chance to have this interview. But what I'm trying to say is, in political science, the basic theory of power is that it's the authority to wield military might is essentially what political power is, and whoever has that is the one who can not just push other people around needlessly, but even if you have like just laws that are great, to enforce them so that people have to sort of care, and even if they don't want to, they, for instance, won't actually pollute the world, or whatever it is that you set up. That is the thing that's like the right thing to do, and even most reasonable people in the world would always agree is the most reasonable thing to do. It's just like I said, it looks to me so far that it's more like you're trying to do what Germany was doing, or is generally as one of the more pacifist states now, is trying to wield power through economic means rather than military means.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very much grounded in realism, or a realist framework that way. Of course, we're very big liberal institutionalists, while we are realists as well. So we recognize the value of institutions, and that's why we're trying to reform them. But at the same time, we recognize that, with the current system, it has, built-in flaws which make us unable to change it, and make us unable to act on certain policies, like nuclear weapons, for example. We will never be able to abolish them, because the states that are able to change the charter are able to pass policy that is binding on nuclear weapons are in power. So
Another quick question I wanted to throw out there that I kind of had was, what's your opinion of propaganda and trying to control elections through, brainwashing of the populace and the media, and basically getting your authoritarian dictator in charge, democratically speaking, maybe like the Nazis did, because they were a democratic country when they happened before World War II, obviously. And, in modern day Russia is arguably by some democratic. So what's your opinion on some of those like propaganda issues, I guess, as far as how to manage them or how to deal with them going forward?
well, as in within nation states, right?
Yeah, well, almost, I guess the idea was, even if, as we move from today to where we want to get this message out there in a way that it doesn't get tarnished or propagandized so that it never happens, right? How do we kind of cut through it all and get to the actual truth? And actually, proof is in the pudding kind of mentality, where we've got to prove that this type of federal system could work. And how do we kind of cut through the propaganda somehow, and avoid, or I guess almost punish, or disincentivize maybe brainwashing or propaganda in some way? Is there any way to do that? It's a tough question, and I'm kind of just picking your brain on what you think about it. And is there a good method to get more truth out there and less propaganda?
I think it is sad, and yeah, especially with what we've been seeing in Russia, it's getting almost very dystopian, where you can just control an entire nation's whatever they see. So is approaching this 1984-esque kind of world. But in terms of what we do at World Federalist Movement Canada, we highlight the fact that we believe internet is a human right. So the freedom of expression and access to content online is definitely something we promote, and hopefully, in terms of our view, down the line, a world federal government which has a good budget, unlike the United Nations budget, would have the capacity to build some infrastructure in remote places that don't have access to the internet, and maybe have its own satellite providers to actually provide information. But that is not really a concept that's been developed or that's been under our projects lately. But it is something that would fall in line with a World Federalist view. Absolutely.
That's awesome. It's definitely something that's always been kind of a passion of mine right from the beginning of all of our stuff, is getting to the actual truth. We've got the TruthWorks project is one of our pillars, providing proof. And I just really interested in kind of, I guess, merging or synergizing with all the different groups to actually get to this truth. And like everything you shared with me today, how do we actually get that proven message out to people in a better and stronger and, I guess, faster way, sooner rather than later? So yeah, thanks so much for sharing.
Related to that, because apart from the major in political science, and one of the reasons why we work on stuff like the TruthWorks project is that I also studied media and communication theory. So for me, those two things were always inextricably connected, even though bizarrely at the time when I was studying at the university, it didn't seem that the teachers there think of it, or the professors think of it the same way, like that it actually is intrinsically connected. It was sort of just before it became really obvious that it is. So in terms of trying to put together something like the World Federalist Movement, I imagine you must be aware that there will be campaigns of indoctrination trying to put that like, oh, it's just Soros-funded globalist conspiracy Illuminati things as of inherently it's very easy to imagine that that's exactly the kind of strategy that if you were to generate any traction, that's the kind of information or disinformation, misinformation opposition that you would be facing. So have you thought about that, like how to sort of defend yourself from accusations of being just another Illuminati group?
Absolutely, yeah, and we do get a lot of these groups that sometimes attack us. So right before the 2023 World Federalist Conference, we had a flat earther group which sent out quite a few attacks, and we were worried during the meeting that this would create problems throughout the conference.
Is it because you're just called global and so you just assume
Yeah,
that the world isn't flat? It's like, why flat earthers?
yeah, and a lot of very right wing or alt right people, I'd
Oh,
say,
so it's
and I
type
don't
of
know.
deal, right?
But I'm using flat earther, of course, as an extreme example. Usually
Okay.
it is people that are very on the alt-right and that think that we are globalists. And we're very aware of this big taboo when we talk about world federalism, where people, they don't think about world federalist government. They think about just world government, right? The federalist kind of
One
goes,
world government, I think, is the
yeah.
phrase.
I think the big scary thing is that one person could be in charge of everybody, from one dictator in charge of everyone. That's the scary thing, or one group of Illuminati in charge of everybody, right? That's how people see a one world government. And I definitely think we have to cut through that misconception. And I think, again, that's really an important part, probably the most important part of groups like the World Federalist Movement is cutting through that miscommunication
So
and
just
showing what we're really all about.
in connection with that, so I think like we should sort of like circle back to use a pun a little bit to get to the rings where if you say that like democracy again is the important element, and when you're saying that it's supposed to be about more democratic representation, so I think like if people sort of if what you mean by that is a thing that is a good thing and is an actual democracy that's actually representative, then that sort of by definition means that you're not an Illuminati, which is an authoritarian sort of totalitarian group that's just dictating to other people what to do. So I think like sort of the crux of the issue is in really in explaining what you mean by democracy as best as well as possible, because even about the European Parliament, which sounds to me right now as sort of the closest thing, like sort of institutionally to maybe what you're proposing that already exists. And I already, of course, am aware of some of the criticisms of European Parliament. And it's like one of those is that it's not actually democratic representation, precisely because on some level it's more in Europe, within European Union, not just European Parliament specifically, but within European Union in its power structures, there is a lot of appointing, like you said with the United Nations, whereas it's not really representative democracy, where on some level somebody voted, and so we had the minimal definition, much like in Russia. We've met the minimum criteria for democracy, but like by having elections. So people voted, ballots were cast, candidates existed, somebody was elected. But then the more important part is not just the theater of democracy, but it's really the people who are actually in power. How are they legitimate? How, in terms of wielding that power in connection to who gives them that power? And usually people understand it in a nation state, that like we are the nation with the citizens, we voted for our representative, so we have a president, the president directly represents us. It's very simple. But sort of, if you make it more international, there's more steps and it gets more complicated, convoluted. So if you're saying sort of democracy and that it's supposed to be more democratic and more representative, I'm just really going to be the political science nitpicker nerd, and I was just going to really drill down on that. So there are various ways by which to measure democracy, something being more or less democratic. So I'll just, if it's okay with you, I would just give you like these pairs of different kinds of democracy, and if you could just respond to like which one of those you feel is like what you're about, what you mean by more democratic. So like, for example, if you have a direct versus indirect representative democracy.
For indirect, it would be for direct democracy, it would be very difficult at this level. So I'd say indirect, but we also definitely believe in a World Citizens Assembly, which would be, kind of a pick of a hat of a few names. They'd be posted on the website basically for people to see, their name, education level, age, etc. And those people would be on a rotating basis every year. They would pick out 20 issues that are of importance to them, and those would form the agenda for some of the representatives. So we mix in a lot of different systems.
Yeah. Great.
Would you mind if I go back to answer the first part of that?
Okay.
Yeah, just because we were talking about, those groups that were attacking the World Federalist Conference, and how do we actually defend ourselves against that? So the irony of World Federalism is we're definitely not an alt-right group. We consider ourselves, politically neutral, but we share a lot of the same criticisms as alt-right groups. So alt-right groups, which attack us most, call us globalists, don't realize that in a lot of ways, the World Federalist government tries to protect national sovereignty. And systems constantly change, right? We had the League of Nations before. As soon as the League of Nations went away, there needed to be another system which would be imposed. And that was the United Nations. And United Nations has been caught in this institutional inertia, as we say, for all these years, because there's no way to change the charter without affecting the interests of the P5. And that'll always be the case. So what we're thinking of is, if the United Nations fails eventually, which we came very close to with the war in Ukraine, then another system would have to replace it. And it's very important to build in these principles to say a constitutionally limited, World Federalist government, where we would protect the rights of nation states, and nation states would, retain the vast majority of control within their domestic economies, but would make some sort of concession to say, okay, maybe not absolute national sovereignty, and maybe we can have a low standard that we can share with other international actors. So those are really how we present it. And there are a lot of alt-right people which have actually changed their minds and joined our group because of this, because they see that we're very critical of the UN system. We're not praising the UN. We're literally looking at it and arguing for reforms to it. So we're not trying to create a giant world government. We're trying to protect what we have, what we've built over the years as human beings, this Westphalian system, but add on a level that is necessary now that we've attained that level of globalization in our evolution.
The biggest argument for World Federalism in my studies, and I'm still kind of new to the whole thing. It's just a couple of months ago I found your website for the first time and was really excited to learn more. But the biggest thing I found was just the reasoning around why we need a World Federalist system. One, for the climate, because we all share it, and you obviously don't want to outsource all your pollution to cheap countries that are willing to let you do it for free because they want the business. And then number two, for kind of managing the global corporations, which are essentially offshoring their taxes or offshoring their dirtiest or worst practices, human rights violations to the countries that allow it. And so these two things kind of by themselves really are enough of a reason that in order to solve these world problems like poverty and slavery and all the issues around that, we need some kind of worldwide cooperation. Otherwise, the global corporations are already global, and they already have more control than most governments. And it just really hit me so hard when I saw the videos on your website that kind of explain this in detail, why we absolutely need it for today. We didn't necessarily need it 100 years ago. There wasn't global corporations in control of everything in the same way. Most things were kind of limited to countries. But now almost all the big countries are, all the big corporations are global. And the only way we could ever hope to combat them and keep them from destroying the world, because that's kind of the capitalist model, is it doesn't control itself, right? It's just whatever way makes the most money goes. And if you can burn the world to make a buck, you burn the world in a strictly capitalist system. So I just thought that was kind of my personal take on why it's so critical. And that's the message we really just have to get out there to everybody.
Globalization's advancements in communications and technology for transportation as well, those are not going away, right? So we have reached this level of globalization, and who benefits most when a system is unregulated? It's corporations, and they take advantage of the people. So.
Yeah, and I definitely
have
a lot of
globalization.
Go ahead,
I just think it's very important to stress. So when you're saying globalization, you don't mean global exploitation of regions. You mean better representation of various world regions.
Yeah. In terms of globalization?
No, I mean, like when you say globalization, or what you're saying, world federalism sounds like it's a global thing that you're trying to do. But much like with European Parliament, it's actually to improve regional representation. It's not to have the powerful people globally ruin whatever parts of the world they feel make the money.
And the European Union is actually one of the best examples of a world federalist or a federalist state at that level, the supranational level.
Yeah, if we don't, I guess the question is, if we don't get a world federalism government at some point in the near future, it's very possible that one or several corporations will take control of the world and they'll rule it de facto, right? And that's kind of what's happening now, where they're buying out governments, they're buying out elections, they're buying out the media, and the media is all controlled by these globalist corporations that are not beholden to the people at all. They're essentially and particularly with automation and robotics, when they no longer need the work of the people, who knows when they might unleash some conspiracy type drug to wipe out 90% of the population and save the world for the 10% of people with money. And these are all obviously scary dystopian things. But if we don't get some kind of world federalism movement together, these are the problems that are bound to happen eventually. And they are happening today.
Yeah,
to some extent.
It's not because you don't have an actual institution in place that there is no system. There's always a system that happens, right?
Yeah. So we're combating that. And that's, I have a lot of libertarian friends who always kind of come back to those kinds of arguments. And it's really fun when you kind of dig into the details and really try to understand, okay, what is it that you want? What are you trying to protect? Capitalism is great, but it has to have limits. You can't have monopolies enslave people at the end of the day. And world federalism can definitely prevent that and help capitalism to thrive so that it has rules to work with. So
speaking of, the libertarian question, why can't it be solved by free market? Like, why doesn't it solve itself through market forces? And why do you have to impose a global institution instead?
Market forces definitely don't account for, pollution and other kind of nuances on the human population. Those aren't counted. Market forces won't prevent a war from happening if it's advantageous for one side rather than the other. And that's what we see constantly. We have this common, saying within World Federalist Movement Canada, is that we spend more on destruction than on development. So we would like to see the reversal of that. And we would like to see, of course, these industries regulated, and for us to find some common ground where we don't say, which is kind of true, and that's what I was talking about, where with the alt-right, where they're saying, oh, put our nation first, and it's stupid is what they'll say to pass to carbon price things in your own nation and to tax corporations because they'll go elsewhere. Well, we're fighting against each other to the lowest common denominator at that point, right? We're fighting against each other. It's a slide down, and then we have offshore tax havens, etc.
I think the term is race to the bottom.
Race to the bottom. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Yeah.
The other thing market forces don't really account for is human rights. At the end of the day, I mean, slavery was huge under capitalism, right? And it just doesn't account for the pain and suffering of the people at its core level, unless you somehow engineer it to, or somehow include it with laws that protect human rights, and it's up to the government to make and enforce those laws, essentially, but hopefully at a worldwide level, that you can't just outsource your bad practices to countries that allow it. So I think it makes sense. Any other deep questions you'd like to get into? I think we've covered a lot of it today. Alex, is there anything else you'd really like to kind of dig deeper on, or any other messages you'd like to share? And Martin, if there's any questions, you can chime in.
Well,
Oh,
I
yeah,
could just
go
like
first.
continue in my pointless exercise a little. It's not very long now. The exercise about the oppositions in democracy. I think like the next one, that's the big one, is sort of majority rule versus proportional, or like so if it's majoritarian or proportional, depending on like depending on if you win the elections, like if you only have your actual share of power depending on your share of votes, or if you just because first past the post, just because you won, you rule for the period. So what's your take on this?
Definitely proportional representation. Yeah, as you know, the first past the post system tends to lead to two parties, and we would have way more than two parties in a world parliament, I guess. So
Yeah,
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
makes a lot of sense. And I think just it's important to go through this. It's like to make it clear that like you're who's actually going to be representing who or how in your system, and therefore how representation or representative is actually going to be. Because I especially liked with your answer, sort of with the direct indirect, that there's still going to be some way for people to directly propose agenda. Because I think that that is an element of direct democracy. I also wanted to ask about referenda, like if there's some place for referenda specifically.
not that I know of. I know Andreas is a big expert on it, and he's written too many books that I could ever read in time for
Yeah.
this. But yes,
So I guess
Andreas
we can put if
also.
you have it's just if you have any links to materials or books or something that you think would be
Sure.
interesting to read, we can definitely, if you share them with us, put them into the information under the video.
Absolutely, yeah, I can link some articles as well in there. And yeah, so this Andreas Bummel, he has written many books, but it's funny because you see his books, which kind of change sometimes, and he talks about different models and different ways of getting there. So it's not very clear, how we would actually form this. I spoke earlier about, West and East Canada, US, right, as electoral districts, but there's also this idea of having parties within nations, get together. So we would probably have like a liberal, NDP, Green, and Democrat for the US, Canada. And then on the other side, you might have, Republican, conservative, PPC.
So
As a
something
coalition.
like coalitions in European Parliament.
Yeah, somewhat like that. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. And so like, I guess the third division, the sort of final big one, is radical versus liberal. Meaning radical in that if the majority, however, even if it's proportional, if they win, so whoever is actually the powerful winning ruling coalition can make laws that can say or do basically whatever, versus liberal where there are inbuilt protections for minorities or those who lose, or depending on what makes them a minority, somehow like maybe have to lose always in terms of democratic rules because they're just never going to be the majority. It's something like the rights of basically endangered groups or ethnic minorities in global context. It could still be, for instance, the LGBTQ people, like somebody who's inherently going to be in a minority. So what are your thoughts on radical versus liberal?
Definitely liberal, which would be constitutionally limited, right? So we're very aware of the dangers of a world government arising. And that's why I can't emphasize it enough that we add that federalist, between world federalist and world federalist government, because we don't want, one power to kind of usurp others and then change the constitution. And then that becomes a dystopian world government. So the world federalist
Makes
government,
sense. Like
very few possibilities for change too, of course. So
yeah. So thank you for answering it and making it clear that it actually sounds rather democratic by the more generous definitions of democratic, and not just functionally democratic in that like, oh, we have election and a government that has representatives and that's enough. So I do like that it's actually sounding like more, when you say more democratic, you mean more democratic and not more Illuminati.
The word I always love is anti-fragile, where the system, the more people that kind of bash it, the more people that talk about it, the stronger it gets and the stronger the arguments get. And if you get a corrupt person in power doing something bad, there's lots of ways to kind of get them out and make it transparent, make it visible, and bring the people and power back to the people to override or overthrow any bad influence throughout the system. So that's kind of the ideas of an anti-fragile system, and I really like how this kind of helps us to engineer that and envision that. Really, it's about the hope of creating those better systems that can give everybody a little more power back to themselves and a little more ability to make the world better.
absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much for joining us today, Alex. Is there any final thoughts or any final things you'd like to throw out there for everybody?
No, just never underestimate your power as a citizen of this world. We have achieved stuff through the World Federalist Movement Canada and other like-minded organizations that we would never have expected to see in the next 100 years, such as the International Criminal Court. We're critical behind that, and the people at our movement who were trying to build that up, they didn't think they'd see it in their lifetime, but it happened for some of them within 10 years of just participating in that project. So we're very hopeful to change the international system, make it more democratic in all the ways that we pursue, such as a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. And I hope you support us to actually achieve this as a world community.
Thank you so much.
What can people do to support you?
To support us, you can definitely donate, of course. That's as a not-for-profit. Donations always help. You can become a member as well, and then participate in our events, participate in our discussions. And if you're really interested, you can apply to be on a advisory council or eventually maybe our board of directors or executive committee. Then you could maybe even lead your own project by volunteering. So if you have any ideas for new projects that you think would be in line with world federalism, definitely please send me an email and I can give you that as well to put in the video.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And again, wfmcanada.org is their site. And if you're interested in learning more about the pillars of Protopia, if this is your first time watching the Saving the World podcast, basically check us out. savingtheworldtogether.org is our main website. And we're hoping to kind of continue to connect and continue to make better content and better ideas, to get more ideas out there on how we can save the world together. And World Federalist Movement is definitely one of those things that I'm super excited that we can kind of connect today and learn from each other, and hopefully we'll continue to be able to build strengthening ties in the future and build better ideas in the future that we can synergize with and work forward together. So thanks so much for joining us, everybody, today, and let's save the world together.